Lonely rancher found a Navajo woman tied to a post and put up for sale. What he did next changed them forever. Blackwood Gulch didn't have a heart. It had a vein thick with silver dust, and the sweat of men who had long forgotten what they were digging for. The sun above hung heavy and unforgiving, baking the wooden roofs until they cracked like old bones. Smoke curled from crooked chimneys, mixing with the stink of horse dung, cheap liquor, and the stench of desperation. It was the kind of place where people came to disappear, or to be disappeared. Caleb Thorne rode in slow, his coat faded and torn at the sleeves, his boots scuffed and silent on the boardwalk. Folks called him the Wanderer, but he didn't much care for names anymore. He'd worn too many soldier, traitor, survivor, ghost stand. None of them fit quite right. All he wanted was a decent horse, a bottle that didn't taste like regret, and maybe, if the day wasn't too cruel, a patch of silence where the war inside him could quiet down. But Blackwood Gulch wasn't known for mercy. As he tied his horse to a rail near the old trading post, the wind shifted. It carried with it the sound of shouting, not the drunken kind, not even the angry kind. Nothis was spectacle. A crowd gathered near the edge of the market square, pressed tight around a rough wooden stage built from stolen lumber and spit. Caleb's instincts told him to walk away. Keep his head low. Let the town rot in its own sickness. But something in that noise, something sharp, like a blade-on bone, drew him in. He stepped into the crowd, boots thudding on sun-warped boards. No one turned. No one noticed. Eyes were locked forward, jaws tight with excitement or disgust. It was hard to tell which in a place like this. On the platform, a man with greasy hair and a broken smile paced like a preacher. He held a rope in one hand, and at the other end of it, a girl. If you believe cowboy love stories still got a place in your heart, drop a 1 in the comments. Let's keep Wild West love alive, partners. She couldn't have been more than 19. Her hands were bound cruelly in front of her, wrists red and swollen. A cloth covered her eyes, but she stood straight, unmoving, even as the crowd shouted slurs and flicked dirt at her bare feet. Her dress was torn, the fabric strange patterned with tribal dyes faded by dust and blood. But it wasn't the dress that stopped Caleb cold. It was the mark. Half hidden behind a curtain of black hair, just beneath her ear, was a tattoo, a raven's wing unfurling into spirals of ink, a symbol he'd never forgotten. Not in all the miles he'd wandered, not in the silence of winter camps or the fever-drenched nights that came after. That mark belonged to the tribe that once saved his life. 5 years back, after the ambush at Dry Mesa, Caleb had crawled half dead through the desert, blood thick in his boots, lungs scorched raw. It was an old Navajo man named Nizoni who had found him. The old man hadn't spoken a word of English, but his hands were steady, his fire warm, his water clean. He had treated Caleb's wounds with herbs and prayers, painted strange symbols on his skin, and whispered to the stars as he worked. When Caleb could walk again, he'd ask through broken gestures why. Nizoni had simply touched the raven mark on his own arm and pointed to the sky. "We carry the fallen," the old man had said in soft, cracking English, "until they can carry themselves. La." Now that same mark was inked on the girl's skin. The auctioneer slammed a hand on the crate beside him. "Not worth a nickel, this one," he barked. "Cursed blood, wild tongue, can't cook, can't clean. Hell, she bit the last man who touched her." Laughter roared from the crowd. A rock flew, hitting the girl's knee. She didn't flinch. Caleb's fingers twitched. His vision tunneled, the world narrowing to that single mark behind her ear. He didn't know her name, didn't know what sin had landed her here, or how she'd survived this long. But he knew this. He owed a debt, and debts like that didn't die easy. He stepped forward, voice low but cutting through the air like thunder. "Stop." The laughter faltered, heads turned. Caleb's eyes locked on the auctioneer. "I'll take her." The man blinked, caught off guard. What was that?" "I said I'll buy her," Caleb growled, stepping onto the platform. His boots echoed like war drums. The crowd murmured. Some sneered. Others chuckled. $5, Caleb added, tossing a silver coin pouch at the man's feet. The auctioneer shrugged. "Hell, sold then. To the fool with a death wish." The rope was thrust into Caleb's hand. The girl stumbled as the cloth was ripped from her eyes. She blinked against the light, then looked at him, truly looked. Her gaze was sharp, guarded, but beneath it, a flicker of something else stirred. Recognition. Hope. Maybe just a question. He reached out, gently touching her arm, voice soft enough for only her to hear. "My name's Caleb," he said. "You're safe now." She didn't speak. Not yet. But she didn't pull away either. The crowd jeered as they stepped off the platform, whispers trailing like smoke. "Cowboy's gone mad. She'll slit his throat in his sleep. Let him die with the savages." Caleb ignored them all. They walked side by side down the alley behind the saloon. Her bare feet padded quiet in the dust. When they reached his horse, she hesitated. "You don't have to ride with me," he said. "But I reckon there's worse places to be than not alone." She stared at him. Then, slowly, she nodded. As he helped her into the saddle, her voice broke the silencery, cracked but steady. "Lyra." He looked at her. "What?" "My name," she said. "It's Lyra." He repeated it softly, like a vow. Lyra. They rode out of Blackwood Gulch, beneath the dying sun. The horizon stretched wide, endless and red. Dust curled up behind them, the town shrinking into memory. And though neither of them said it aloud, both knew something had begun. A reckoning. They left Blackwood Gulch behind before the sun had fully set, its jagged roofs and rusted chimneys swallowed by the haze of distant dust. The road ahead stretched quiet and wide, painted in gold and blood by the dying light. Caleb didn't speak for a long time, and neither did she. There were too many eyes back in town, too many mouths ready to speak curses over the heads of those who dared walk against the current. But here, beyond the last cattle fence and the whimper of dying townsfolk, was silence. Honest silence. The kind Caleb hadn't known in years. He rode in front, one hand loose on the reins, the other resting near the revolver on his belt knot out of mistrust, but habit. Behind him, Lyra sat straight, hands folded tight around the saddle's edge. He could hear her breathing, shallow and steady, like someone who'd learned long ago that noise made you a target. They made camp beneath the ribs of a sun-bleached canyon, where boulders jutted from the ground like broken teeth. Caleb built a small fire from dead mesquite and offered her a strip of jerky, a tin cup of warm water. She took them both without a word, sitting on the far side of the fire, her eyes always watching. Not him exactly, just the space between them. "You gonna sleep with one eye open?" Caleb asked, his voice low, non-threatening. She chewed slowly, swallowed, and finally answered, "Maybe." He nodded. "Fair." The stars bled through the dark, spilled across the sky like something torn open. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled lonesome, maybe angry. Lyra didn't flinch. "You from out east?" she asked suddenly, eyes still on the fire. Caleb blinked. It had been days since anyone asked him anything that wasn't followed by a threat. "Virginia," he said, "used to be." "What made you leave?" He looked up at the stars. "The war." She didn't ask which one. In 1880, they were all still bleeding. They didn't speak much after that. She curled into her blanket with her back to the fire, and Caleb sat upright, rifle across his lap, watching the flames dance until his eyes stung. By dawn, the red dust had already begun to rise. They crossed into the desert proper before midday. Here, the land turned strangit-wisted. Rock formations coiled like sleeping snakes, and the sand turned redder with every step. There were no roads now, only suggestions. Dry washes where rain once fell, lizard tracks, wagon ruts, long buried beneath time. Lyra dismounted at one point, crouching near a shallow bend in the trail. Caleb watched her fingers brush the ground, feel the angle of a broken twig, sift the ash of an old fire pit. "They passed through here," she murmured. 3 nights ago, maybe 4. Caleb frowned. "You sure?" She looked up at him, eyes narrow. "You doubt me?" He raised both hands. "Just askin'." She stood and dusted her hands on her skirt. "They're heading west, toward Silver Creek. That's outlaw country." She nodded. "So is everywhere, if you're Navajo." There was no anger in her tone, just truth. Caleb let the silence settle again. As they rode, he noticed how easily she read the land. A drag mark behind a bush, a snapped cactus spine. Even the way birds shifted overhead seemed to tell her something. He'd spent years in deserts like this in patrol, on the run, on the edge of dying Gand, yet he felt like a child next to her. Every time he glanced back, she was there, steady in the saddle, her black hair tied with a strip of worn leather, eyes scanning the world like it owed her an answer. Around dusk, they found shelter beneath an overhang carved by wind and time. As Caleb gathered brush for a small fire, Lyra stared across the open valley below. "They took my sisters on a night like this," she said softly. Caleb didn't ask her to explain. Still, the words came. "There were horses. 20. Maybe more. We didn't hear them until it was too late. They rode in like smoke fast, screaming, guns firing in the dark. My father, he stood his ground. They shot him, twice. Then again, just to make sure." Caleb didn't move. He stared at the flame, licking the wood in his hand. "They dragged us out of the huts. Me, Ilara, and Thalia. Ilara's 14. Thalia just turned 10. Her voice cracked. I bit one of them. He laughed. Said I had fire, but he'd break it." She looked at him then, her face lit by firelight, and for a moment Caleb saw all of it, the blood, the fear, the shackles, and still, she hadn't broken. "I escaped the next day," she said, "slipped out under the canvas while they were drunk, but I couldn't get them out. I ran. I ran until my legs gave out. The desert took me. Then those traitors found me and dragged me to Blackwood." Caleb let out a breath. "You think they're still in Silver Creek?" She nodded. "They don't move fast. Reaper, he's the one in charge. He likes to make camp near the river, where the ground's soft. Easier to control people when they're half mad from thirst." Caleb's jaw tightened. "I've heard of him. Steel Reaper. Used to work for the railroads. Burned a Navajo village when they resisted. Took their silver and left their dead in the river." Lyra looked away. "That was my uncle's village." They didn't speak after that. The fire burned low. The stars wheeled overhead, and somewhere beyond the ridges, coyotes sang for the dying. The third day turned hotter. The sky pressed down like a fist, and the red rock shimmered with heat. Their canteens ran low, and Caleb rationed what little water they had left. Lyra didn't complain. She barely drank. "Don't go fainting on me," he warned as they crossed a dried-up creek bed. She smirked. "I grew up on less." By afternoon, they reached a narrow pass between two towering ridges. From above, it looked like a jagged scar cut through the land-sharp rock walls, casting deep shadows. Lyra slowed her horse. "They call this place the Canyon of Whispers," she said. Caleb looked around. "Why?" She tilted her head. "Because everything echoes, even your guilt." He didn't laugh. Instead, he let the name settle in his bone. Near the canyon's mouth, they dismounted. Lyra knelt again, brushing sand from a small indentation in the earth. She held up a thread of frayed rope, burned at the end. "They were here, and not long ago." Caleb scanned the canyon walls. "You think your sisters are still with them?" "They would be," Lyra said, "until he sells them, or worse." Her fingers curled into fists. "I'll get them back," she whispered, "even if it kills me." Caleb stared at her a long moment, then nodded once. "Then we'd better move before nightfall. You said Reaper likes rivers? I know one snake's spine. Runs past Silver Creek. Lot of outlaws set camp near there." Lyra's eyes met his. "That's where they'll be." Ling. And beneath the crimson sun, two silhouettes rode into the canyon, silent and burning with the same fire. Not of revenge, but of restoration. They reached the ridge just before dusk, where the land dropped off suddenly like God himself had carved a scar into the desert. Below, shadows stretched long and deep, and the heat of the day still shimmered above the cracked rocks. Caleb reined in his horse and stared down into the jagged spine of earth known as Dead Man's Hollow. Lyra called it something else. "This place," she murmured, sliding down from her horse, "we call it Nashdwitso Ba Huhanthi, home of the cursed bear." Caleb followed, crouching beside her as she scanned the ravine below. From this distance, the signs were faint but undeniable. Thin trails of smoke rising from a sheltered bend, the glint of tin and steel near a flickering campfire, and a half-circle of wagons that looked like they hadn't moved in days. "There," she said, her voice tightening. "That's Reaper's camp." Caleb raised his spyglass. He saw at least a dozen men milling around the firesome, standing, others sitting with rifles across their laps. The way they lounged, drunk and overconfident, told him everything he needed to know. These men weren't expecting a fight, but it was the two figures near the center that made his breath catch. Two young girls, bound at the wrists, sitting close to the flames but apart from the men. One leaned against the other, her head resting on a thin shoulder, both faces hollow and pale even from this distance. Still, Caleb recognized the sharp lines of Lyra's jaw in their profiles. "Ilara," Lyra breathed. "And Thalia." She didn't cry, didn't shake, but her fingers dug into the rock beneath them, and for a moment her whole body went still, like stone. Then she whispered, "They're alive." Caleb lowered the spyglass and looked at her. "We can't go in loud," he said quietly. "Not yet. Too many guns, too many men." Lyra nodded. "We wait until night. I can get to the girls if you cover me." He raised an eyebrow. "You sure? I've crawled through worse." He didn't doubt it. They retreated from the ridge and led the horses to a sheltered crevice, masking their presence with brush and dirt. The sun bled into the horizon, staining the canyon walls red like an open wound. Night fell fast, wrapping the desert in a velvet silence, only broken by the distant laughter of the outlaws and the restless stomp of horses. They didn't speak much as they checked weapons. Caleb loaded his Winchester with slow precision, counting the rounds like prayers. Lyra sharpened her knife on a flat rock, the sound grating and steady. Finally, Caleb broke the silence. "You ready for this?" Lyra looked up. Her eyes were dark, unreadable. "I was born ready for this." "Lou." They moved like ghosts, hugging the rock walls as they descended into the canyon. Moonlight spilled silver over the path, but the shadows were thick, and Caleb trusted Lyra's feet more than his own. She led them around loose shale and down a narrow game trail he never would have spotted alone. When they reached the sentry half asleep, propped against a rock with a bottle in his lap, Lyra didn't hesitate. She slipped behind him and dragged the knife clean across his throat, catching his body before it could slump and alert the others. Caleb didn't flinch. He just kept moving. Closer now, they could hear snatches of conversationmen bragging about stolen horses, laughing about burning down a redskin village, and placing crude bets on how much silver the girls might fetch. Lyra's hand clenched tight around her blade. "Stay focused," Caleb whispered. They reached the edge of the camp just as the last outlaw stumbled to his bedroll. Most were drunk, boots still on, pistols tucked under arms. The fire cracked low, casting twitching shadows on canvas and rock. Caleb tapped Lyra's shoulder. "Now." She slipped through the camp like smoke, ducking between wagons, past crates of stolen ammo and rusted saddles. Caleb crouched behind a rock, rifle ready, his breath slow and measured. Lyra reached the girls. Ilara stirred first, her eyes wide and wild, but recognition flickered when she saw her sister. Lyra pressed a finger to her lips and sliced the rope around their wrists. Thalia let out a broken sob. Lyra hushed her with a touch. They started back the way they came, almost made it. Then a bottle rolled off a crate, clinking against the stone. One of the bandits stirred. "Saturday up." "Who's there?" he muttered, blinking through the dark. Caleb didn't hesitate. His rifle cracked once the man dropped without a sound, but the damage was done. A shout rose, then another. Shadows stirred. Firelight flared. "Run," Caleb barked, laying down cover fire. The canyon exploded into chaos. Bullets tore through the night. Horses screamed and stampeded. The girls scrambled after Lyra, skirts catching on rocks. Caleb dropped 2 men before they could fire. A third lunged with a knife. Lyra drove her blade into his gut with a snarl. They climbed toward the ridge, gunfire chasing them every step. Caleb paused at the top, turned, and fired his last 2 rounds. Both found their mark. He slung the rifle and hauled Thalia over the final rise. When they reached the horses, he was bleeding, just to graze, but enough to sting. "You all right?" he gasped. Lyra nodded, pulling her sisters into the saddle. "We ride." And they did. Hard and fast through the rocks, through the dark, with bullets hissing through the air like angry bees. But the canyon fell away behind them, and eventually the night swallowed the sounds of pursuit. They rode until the moon was high, and the girls could barely stay upright. When they finally stopped, It was beneath a cluster of dry juniper, the horses slick with sweat, the sisters clinging to each other like children in a storm. Caleb dropped to his knees, breathing hard. Lyra crouched beside him, her face streaked with dirt, her eyes blazing. "We did it," she whispered. He looked at her, then at the girls alive, safe, shivering, but whole. "For now," he said, "but Reaper's still out there." Lyra's jaw tightened. "He won't be for long." They set camp in a box canyon Lyra knew hidden from view, shielded by stone. Caleb dressed his wound while Lyra fed her sisters and whispered stories in Navajo that made them smile through their exhaustion. Later, as the fire crackled low, she walked over to Caleb and sat beside him. "I want to kill him," she said. He didn't ask who. "I want to see the fear in his eyes before he dies," she added. Caleb nodded slowly. "You'll get your chance." She looked at him then, really looked. For the first time, there was no armor in her gaze. "You think revenge will fix this?" she asked. He considered. "Number. But it's a start." She leaned back against the rock wall, eyes on the stars. "When I saw you in Blackwood," she said, "I thought you were just another man who wanted to feel powerful." Caleb scoffed. "You weren't wrong. But you stayed," she continued, "and you fought for someone who wasn't yours to fight for." He shrugged. "Someone did the same for me once. You know." She looked at her sisters, then back at him. "I think my father sent you." Caleb said nothing. In the silence, the desert wind blew soft. Somewhere beyond the ridge, coyotes howled again. Only this time, it didn't sound like mourning. It sounded like warning. They rose before the first streaks of light painted the eastern horizon, the desert still draped in a hush so deep it felt sacred. The kind of silence that comes before something breaks, like the calm inside a rifle barrel, seconds before the hammer falls. Lyra stood by the fire's dying embers, tying her hair back with a leather cord. Her blade, freshly honed, caught the faintest glimmer of moonlight. Caleb checked the Winchester, sliding cartridges into the chamber one by one, his fingers moving slow and sure, like a man loading not just bullets, but the weight of choice. Thalia and Alara still slept, curled together like cubs in the shadow of a boulder. Caleb watched them for a moment, the innocence in their faces sharpened by the knowledge of how quickly it had been stolen. "They'll come for us," Lyra said without turning. "Reaper doesn't let go of what he thinks is his." "I know," Caleb replied. "That's why we won't wait." She looked at him. "You mean to end this today?" He nodded. "We don't run anymore." Yusen, her eyes, usually guarded, flickered with something harder than fear conviction. They packed quickly, left the girls with enough food and water to last the day, hidden in a shallow cave beneath a crooked overhang. Lyra kissed each of them softly, whispering something in Navajo that neither Caleb nor the wind caught. Then she rose, expression unreadable, and mounted her horse. They rode south, skirting the ridgeline of the desert basin, until they reached a place Caleb remembered from his scouting Desa dry wash that funneled riders into a natural bottleneck. Narrow, exposed, a place where numbers didn't matter as much as timing. Devil's Hollow, the locals called it. Perfect. They took up positions. Caleb high on the ridge with his rifle, Lyra hidden behind a cluster of stones near the choke point, traps and rockfalls prepared with grim patience. When everything was set, they waited and waited. It wasn't long before the first dust cloud rose in the distance. A sound like distant thunder carried through the canyon hoofbeats, heavy and unrelenting. Lyra crouched low, lips moving in a silent prayer not of peace, but of vengeance. She didn't ask for survival, she asked for justice. They came in loud 12 riders, dust-covered, guns out, confidence dripping from every shout and curse. Reaper led them, face wrapped in black cloth, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. His rifle bounced across his back, and the revolvers at his hips gleamed like silver fangs. They didn't see it coming. Caleb took the first shot. The lead horse reared back, screaming as the bullet ripped through its rider's chest. The man pitched forward, limp, as chaos exploded through the line. Screams, gunfire, horses crashing into one another. Another shot, then another. Men dove for cover, firing wildly toward the rocks. Caleb stayed low, calm, breathing with each squeeze of the trigger. 4 down in less than 30 seconds. Below, Lyra sprang from cover. Her knife flashed first into a rider's thigh, then across a throat. She moved like smoke, swift and silent, dancing between gunshots and boots. Reaper shouted orders, firing blindly into the ridge. "Find him! Kill the son of A!" A bullet grazed his shoulder. He cursed and wheeled his horse, retreating deeper into the hollow. "Damn cowards running," Caleb muttered, eyes narrowing. One of the outlaws scrambled up the ridge toward Caleb's position. The man got within 10 feet before a boot caught loose gravel, and he slipped. Caleb finished him before he hit the ground. The fighting thinned. The remaining outlaws, shaken and bloodied, turned to flee. Caleb dropped one mid-turn. Another disappeared behind the rocks. 2 more galloped out of the canyon, kicking up blood-stained dust. Silence returned, only broken by the shallow, panicked breaths of dying horses. Caleb rose, Winchester still hot in his hands, and scanned the canyon. Lyra stood in the center, her boots soaked, her knife red, her chest rising and falling like a storm finally breaking. "It's not over," she said. She was right. From the far end of the hollow, movement Reaper, dragging himself behind a boulder, clutching at a bleeding leg. His hat was gone, and his face was no longer hidden. Caleb climbed down as Lyra walked toward the last man alive. She didn't run. She stalked, deliberate. Reaper tried to lift his revolver, but his hand shook. The moment he met her eyes, the fury in them drained the color from his face. "You," he croaked. "You're the one from Black River." She didn't respond, just kept walking. He tried again. "It wasn't personal, girl, just business. Your old man, he stood in the way." Lyra stopped, towering above him, shadow long across his chest. "He was my father," she said, "and you burned his name into ash." Reaper Lafida, thin, desperate sound. "Then do it," he hissed. "You think it'll make it right?" She raised the knife. "No," she whispered, "but it'll make it done." The blade flashed once, then again, and then Reaper was still. The wind picked up, tugging strands of Lyra's hair loose as she stood over the body. For a moment, no one moved. Not Caleb, not even the desert. When she finally turned, her expression was unreadable. "He's gone," she said. Caleb nodded slowly. "Now it's done." They didn't speak much on the ride back. The sun rose higher with each mile, painting the desert in gold and heat. Vultures circled behind them. The silence between them wasn't hollow, it was full, of understanding, of things neither needed to say aloud. When they reached the cave, Alara and Thalia came running, crying out in relief. Lyra caught them both in her arms, holding them so tightly Caleb thought she might never let go. But even as the girls sobbed, even as Lyra whispered soothing words into their tangled hair, her eyes flicked once toward the horizon, toward the canyon now behind them, toward the man she had left there in the dirt. Caleb saw it then, the last trace of weight leave her shoulders. That night, as they camped beneath a starlit sky, Lyra finally sat beside him again. They shared a strip of meat, a flask of water, and nothing else for a long while. Then she spoke. "You stayed," she said softly, "when you didn't have to." He didn't look at her, just tossed a branch into the fire. "You think I'd let a promise die out there?" She turned toward him. "I think you're a man who carries his own ghosts." He gave a half smile. "Aren't we all?" A long silence followed. Then, for the first time, she smiled, not the broken, bitter curve of someone surviving. A real smile, like something new had begun. The sun hung low on the western horizon, casting long shadows over the red earth of Navajo territory. Caleb stood at the edge of the village, his saddlebags packed, his stallion restless beneath him. The scent of cedar smoke and fresh fry bread drifted from the hearths behind him, mingling with the laughter of children and the distant sound of drums calling the evening to prayer. Behind him, Lyra stood quietly, her arms folded across her chest. The firelight caught the beaded pattern on her new shawl-deep blues and warm ochres, spelling stories only the wind could read. Her sisters, Alara and Thalia, were seated near the elder's fire, weaving the final strands of a blanket they'd begun that first night home. "You sure you don't want to stay?" Lyra finally asked, her voice soft, knowing. Caleb didn't turn immediately. He let his eyes trace the line where desert met sky, where the golden ridge of mesas looked like broken teeth in God's old jaw. "I ain't good at staying," he said finally. Never been. You stayed when I was bleeding in the canyon, she said. Stayed when bullets were flying. Stayed when Reaper had a knife to my sister's neck. He smiled just barely. That was different. No, she stepped forward, her bare feet stirring the dust. That was you choosing not to run. That was you coming back to life. He turned to her then, really looked. Her face, once gaunt and etched with defiance, now held warmth like the first thaw after a brutal winter. She had survived. They all had. I got nothing to give this place but my shadow, he murmured. Lyra shook her head. You gave us more than that. You gave us each other again. You gave me back my voice. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the wind slipping between the adobe homes. Caleb stepped forward, holding out something small wrapped in cloth. She opened it to find a silver spur, polished and glinting with an eagle etched on the side. This was my father's, he said. He wore it the day he died in the canyon outside El Paso. I swore I'd never give it to anyone less brave than him. She looked up, startled. Caleb, he shook his head. Don't say nothin', you earned it. Lyra's fingers closed around the spur like it was a piece of his sulin, maybe it was. He touched the brim of his hat, then swung into the saddle. As he nudged the horse forward, he heard her whisper, You'll always have a home here. He didn't look back. The ride was long, sun-baked, and bitter with goodbye. But Caleb didn't feel hollow the way he usually did after leaving something good behind. Instead, something warm pulsed low in his chest. Like a river beneath the dust, something new, something steady. He traveled days through scrublands and dry ravines, past coyotes that watched with golden eyes and crows that circled slow above his head. One night, as he camped beneath the stars, he took out the beaded necklace the elder had pressed into his hand as he left. It was strung with turquoise and obsidian and bore the symbol of a rising sun. You carry our hope now, the old man had said. Don't let it turn bitter. Caleb didn't know what future lay ahead. He didn't care to plan far. But he knew one thing with more certainty than he'd ever known in his life. He wasn't running anymore. By mid-autumn, Caleb reached a small outpost town near the Colorado border. It was cleaner than Blackwood Gulch, but just as brittle in its bonesdry well, a single saloon, and a sheriff who looked like he hadn't smiled since the war between the states. Caleb traded his rifle for tools, found work repairing fences, helping widows mend roofs, and even taught a boy how to ride bareback without breaking his neck. And when the preacher's wife asked him to stay for Sunday supper, he did. Months passed. Then one spring morning, while fixing a broken axle for the town's school teacher, a wagon rolled in from the north. 3 women stepped down, 2 young, bright-eyed sisters, and a tall woman draped in ochre and turquoise, with a necklace that caught the light like starlight. Caleb froze. The wrench slipped from his fingers. Lyra didn't smile, not at first. She walked toward him slowly, deliberate as the desert rain. You didn't write, she said. He wiped his hands on a rag. His voice caught somewhere between his throat and his boots. Didn't figure you'd want me to. She nodded. I didn't. That hurt more than it should have. But then Thalia asked about the man who taught her how to sharpen a knife with her heart instead of her hands, and Alara said her dreams didn't feel safe anymore without your stories. Caleb swallowed. So what are you doing here? Lyra reached into her satchel and pulled out the silver spur. Returnin' this, she said. It's yours. He stared at it for a long time before shaking his head. No, it ain't. It never was. It was always meant for you. She smiled, small and slow. Then I guess I'll keep it, right next to my heart. The preacher's bell rang. Children poured from the schoolhouse. A new day was beginning. Lyra looked around. This town, it needs mending. He glanced at the crooked fence posts, the tired faces, the cracked glass windows. Yeah, it does. Lay. She stepped closer. You still afraid of stayin', Caleb? He looked at her, at the sisters unpacking jars of beans and dried corn from their wagon, at the circle of people gathering by the chapel. He looked at his hands scarred but steady now. No, he said, not anymore. That night, under a sky full of stars and coyotes singing far off, Caleb sat beside a fire, the warmth of it curling into his bones. Lyra leaned against him, her breath steady. Ilara and Thalia danced barefoot in the dust. their laughter rising like wind chimes on a breeze. Caleb remembered Blackwood Gulch, the rot, the gun smoke, the smell of blood. He remembered the moment he saw Lyra for the first time, her eyes like river stones, defiant and unbroken. He remembered the feel of Reaper's blade slicing his shoulder, and the way Lyra's arrow flew like it had a soul of its own. But most of all, he remembered what it felt like to believe in something again. The old him died in that canyon. What rose from the ashes wasn't a hero, wasn't a legend, just a man who had finally stopped running, a man who had found something worth staying for, a man with a river in his chest clear, deep, and flowing. The desert was quieter now, not just around him, but within him. Caleb rode through the Badlands as if the wind had folded its arms in respect. The hooves of his Mustang barely kicked up dust anymore, each step soft, unhurried, like the rhythm of a lullaby he'd forgotten in his childhood. The stars above had come out like curious children, peeking through the cracked ceiling of the world. They blinked silently, watching him ride. He didn't know exactly where he was going. He only knew he didn't need a destination anymore. The burdens he once carried had been laid down, one by one, along the trail of fire and redemption that stretched behind him. He no longer felt the weight of his rifle. He hadn't touched it since the night of the canyon. It hung there on his back, but now more like a relic, a reminder not of vengeance, but of the day he chose to live differently. Lyra's face floated in his mind like the moonlight on water, calm, fierce, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with shape or symmetry. She was all bone and storm and roots, clinging to the cliffside of survival. And she had forgiven the world for what it did to her. That alone made her more powerful than any outlaw he'd ever met. He remembered the last thing she said to him before he left. "Even eagles must land sometimes, Caleb." He had only smiled, touched the side of her face gently, and replied, "And sometimes, Lyra, they fly because they're meant to remind us what freedom looks like." They hadn't kissed. They didn't need to. Some connections are made with something deeper than lips, something bone-deep, scar-cut, and soul-stitched. And they both knew, if ever the desert called again, they'd find each other on the wind. The horse shifted under him slightly, letting out a soft huff. Caleb reached down and stroked its mane. "You and me, old boy," he muttered. "Just the land and the sky now." He passed through an abandoned gold-mining town. Wooden buildings leaned on each other like drunkards at closing time. A rusted sign squeaked in the breeze, swinging above what used to be a saloon. For a moment, he could hear the ghost of a piano playing, laughter and glass shattering, boots stomping, then silence. He tipped his hat, as if saluting the dead, and kept riding. As the sky began bleeding orange on the horizon, he came upon a ridge that overlooked the plains far below. It was the kind of view that made a man feel both small and infinite. The land stretched on forever, broken only by the winding line of a river catching the last of the sun like a blade dipped in gold. Caleb dismounted, walked to the edge. He took the eagle pendant from his neck, the one Lyra had pressed into his palm that morning, whispering, "So you never forget who you became." He held it to the light. Its turquoise glowed faintly, almost pulsing. And for the first time in years, he let the tears come. They weren't tears of pain or grief or regret. They were just release, like the land exhaling. He knelt, dug a small hole with his hands, and placed the pendant inside. "This place will remember me," he whispered. "Not for what I took, but for what I gave back." The wind rose, circling him like a friend. Then, without fanfare, he stood, adjusted his saddle, swung back up, and rode down the ridge toward the distant river, not like a man running from something, but like one finally riding home.